Hey everyone, welcome back to System Shogun. Today we're diving into an essential tool for anyone working with Azure, and that is Bicep. But before we jump into the code for this demo, let's talk about why we need it in the first place. Imagine setting up multiple cloud resources like databases, virtual machines, and storage accounts manually. Not only is it time consuming, but it's also easy to make mistakes and hard to keep track of changes. This is where infrastructure as code, or IAC, comes in. IAC is all about using code to automate your cloud infrastructure in a clear, repeatable way, which makes deployments faster, consistent, and easy to version control. That's right, you can put your infrastructure as code in version control. There are a few IAC tools out there like Terraform and ARM templates for Azure, but ARM templates can get complex and hard to read, especially as your project grows. That's why Microsoft created Bicep. Bicep is a simple, more readable language for deploying Azure resources. It's designed to be ARM's better half, making it easier to write and manage your Azure infrastructure. And now, let's get our hands dirty and see that in action. So, what is the alternative? Well, the alternative is that you go manually in the portal in Azure and you start creating resources. But that's so time consuming and error prone. And you don't want to do that in a production environment because it will lead you to trouble. Can you imagine creating resources every single time a new environment needs to be created, or changing resources and messing it up because you added a resource that had the wrong configuration or the wrong name or wrong resource group? Millions of things can go wrong if you are following the manual approach. Now, don't get me wrong, the manual approach is fine when you're trying things for the first time. For example, if I want to create an environment just to test things up, just to see some proof of concept, of course, I'll start with the portal. I'll create the whole environment, I'll provision all of the resources that I need, and when I'm done, then I'll think about how I can move all that to IAC. So I have a working environment, but also I have the code, the infrastructure as code for that environment. So tomorrow, if I need to deploy that again to some other place or make some changes, I can do that in the code that's version controlled. Okay, now let's start by creating our first Bicep file. If you want to follow along, you need to have the Azure CLI, which comes with Bicep included. So assuming that you have that, let's start with our demo. So here I'm in Cursor, and I'll start creating some resources. Let's first start by creating a new file. Let's call it infra for infrastructure.bicep. Let's start by creating a resource group. How do we create a resource group using Bicep? Well, it's pretty straightforward. I'll copy the code because I don't want to waste time typing all this. It would make the video way longer. And here it is. This is how you create a resource group using Bicep in Azure. Okay, we have that. Now, how do we deploy this? Using the CLI, of course, you type the following command. You choose the location, which is West Europe, and you type the file here. Let's try this. So it's running and it's done. It says here succeeded. So let's check in Azure if we have the resource group now. So we're back in Azure. Let's go to resource groups. And yes, we have our new resource group and we deployed that using Bicep. Exciting. Okay, but resource group is only the beginning. Let's continue with deploying something else. Let's say we want to deploy Key Vault. How do we do that? We're back in our cursor. If we want to deploy Key Vault, I'll again paste the code here. The idea is not to memorize the code you can find in the documentation. So the code here is not important. The important is the idea and to see how things match and go together. Let's now create our Key Vault. Okay, here is the code for provisioning Key Vault, but something's not right here. And the problem is that we're using the scope of a subscription which is fine for resource group because resource groups reside inside subscriptions, but resources like Key Vault, they reside within a resource group. Key Vault needs to be inside a resource group scope. And now I'll introduce you to modules. One way to solve this is to create a module. So let's do that. Let's call this Key Vault Bicep. Okay, now let's move this into here. And now, as you can see, we don't have any errors or the squiggly. Now, how do we reference that though? Well, we need to use the following. Now, I need to explain a few things here. First, I'm using a convention for naming my resources, which is pretty common. We have the shorthand for the resource type, which for example here is resource group. We have the name of our application, which is my API. We'll deploy one web API to see everything in action. We have the environment, which in our case is prod, and we have the location of our resources. We have a scope of resource group, and we're targeting this resource group here. So we're deploying our Key Vault inside this resource group. Also, we're using depends on, which means that we need this to be done before we continue with this, because we need to have a resource group first before we move on with the Key Vault provisioning. Okay, now we start getting so much duplication here, and I want to fix that. So let's create a new Bicep file and call it variables. In here, we'll put some variables that we can use throughout our Bicep files. Okay, I'll copy what I have. We have the environment, we have the project name, we have the resource group, we have the tenant ID, we have the location here. And now we can change this here. For example, we don't need to hard code the resource group anymore. And for our Key Vault, same thing. We can change that to this. And now we need to import that variable Bicep file. Thank you, cursor. And we have one place for our configuration, which is nice. Okay, so we have Key Vault, we have our resource group, but now let's also move the resource group in its own module. So let's create a new RG Bicep and let's copy this right here, and let's remove this because we don't need it, but we need this right here. So we need the module. Okay, so we have the Key Vault, we have the resource group. Now let's put a secret in our Key Vault. How do we do that? Well, let's go to our Key Vault Bicep file and paste this. Okay, so we're creating a new secret which expires in 2 years. This is the key, which is a secret message, and this is the value. Now we're ready with the Key Vault. See how intuitive it is. You have a Key Vault, you have a secret, all that goes into version control, it's visible. You are protected from making manual mistakes because we're humans, we make mistakes. Once you're sure, once you've tested this code, you know that it's, well, like they call it, idempotent. So every time it will do the same thing. Unlike humans, we make mistakes. Now, let's provision app service because I want to deploy a web API later on and see like how everything works together. For that, let's create, you guessed it, a new Bicep file. One thing I forgot is to add this right here, and this will output the value of our Key Vault URI. That's something we will need in our app Bicep file, where we will provision the app service, and that app service will use Key Vault. The URI, we'll put that in the app settings as a variable. You see how in a bit. And here is the Key Vault URI that will pass here. So we're ready with the app service Bicep file. Let's go back here. And here is our code for the app service. The app service depends on the Key Vault module. We need the Key Vault provision before we move on with the app service. And then we'll get the Key Vault URI and pass it as a parameter through here, and the app service will use that URI and will create a new environment variable, and you'll see that later. One thing that's left is we need to add a role-based access control in Key Vault and to add the role of Key Vault secrets user to our app service, because otherwise the app service won't be able to read the secrets from the Key Vault. So now let's create a new file. Let's call it rows Bicep. In here, let's paste this. As you can imagine, we need to pass some parameters here to make this work. So let's name this param Key Vault ID, service ID. We don't need a scope, so what's left is the principal ID. Change this here, and this, and this. Thank you, cursor. Now we need to pass all this from the outside. And we need to output all this. Let's go to Key Vault. We need to output the Key Vault ID. Thank you, cursor. Let's go to app service. Okay, let's go back to infrastructure. I think this is enough for us to test and see if it works or not. So let's try this. We'll use the same CLI command. Let's try this. And great, so we didn't get any errors, which is usually a good sign. Let's now go to Azure portal and see what we've got. So let's click on the resource group. Great, we have our resource group, we have an app service, we have a Key Vault. All of them reside within West Europe. Let's take a quick look in the Key Vault. So here's our secret message, the one that we've provisioned using the infrastructure as code method in Bicep. So now let's go to Visual Studio, and this is the project I've prepared for this demo. It's pretty simple. It's a simple web API. We're using .NET 8, and we have one simple endpoint called Key Vault secret. This here, we're getting the variable that we created. If you remember, when we were creating the app service, we also created an app setting called Key Vault URI, which has the value of Key Vault URI that we've put as a parameter from right here. So once we've got the Key Vault created, we outputted the URI and we put it inside this as a parameter. And then when we were provisioning the app service, we also provisioned an environment variable called Key Vault URI. Let's get back to Visual Studio. And this is the environment variable. We're using managed identity credential. What that means is that we are going to authenticate with the managed identity. And remember the role-based access control that we made in the app service. This is how we authenticate. When we created this here, roles Bicep, we added the role Key Vault secrets user to our app service. So now our app service has this role inside our Key Vault. And this is pretty straightforward. We're creating the secret message here and we're returning the value. Okay, so let's deploy this and see if it works. Let's click on Azure here. We're using Linux. Here's our app service. We don't need this. Click next. Use this first option here. Okay, let's now publish this. Okay, so our application has been deployed. Here's the application endpoint. If we go to Key Vault secret, we get the message. What we did is we used infrastructure as code. We used Bicep to provision our environment. I think this is a great start for you to start exploring Bicep and Azure. Thanks so much for watching this video, guys. I hope you learned something today. If you liked the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with others. Until next time, keep being this awesome. System Shogun out.